TV1 රැස්වීදෙන ජීවිතේ.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
Very good evening to you. This is Newsline Zoom on a day that we have marked Thai Pongal. So to everybody, I hope you all have a wonderful year in which today we celebrate Thai Pongal. So happy Thai Pongal. And this evening we are going by Zoom because our guest is based out in Singapore, the country that apparently wanted to follow Sri Lanka. Anyway, here we are, live by Zoom is Dr. Lahiru Wijedasa, who has just been appointed the Asia Coordinator for Forest, the Asia Forest Coordinator. He'll let you tell us all about it in a moment. Welcome to Newsline Zoom, Dr. Lahiru Wijedasa. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Haris. Happy to be here.
And tell me, Dr. Lahiru Wijedasa, you've been appointed the Asia Forest Coordinator. By whom have you been appointed?
Okay, it's actually an NGO called BirdLife International. BirdLife International is the world's oldest NGO and also one of the largest, and it works with project partners in 130 countries. So it is one of the largest ones. And in Sri Lanka, we're working with the Field Ornithology Group. So we have a partner in Sri Lanka already. And
how is the work of your NGO doing around the world, and especially in Sri Lanka?
It's quite good because it believes in working, like supporting local partners. So instead of actually being an NGO with boots on the ground, it actually has local partners who are part of the local system. And it's a very different model. I don't think anyone else has that model.
Okay. And what exactly does your NGO do then?
Well, so we mainly focus a lot on birds and birds as indicator species for conservation work. But it also believes strongly in sustainable livelihoods, that if you want to really conserve habitats and birds and environment, you actually need to look at that community aspect of it. So for instance, something that we do in Indonesia is that outside of the protected areas, if you want to get the forest protected, we're actually working with the communities on agroforestry techniques to improve their livelihoods. So it kind of saves the forest nearby, because that's the most important interaction right now, that in places where a lot of deforestation is happening, people don't necessarily want to deforest and damage the environment, but they also want a livelihood. So if you want to save and conserve, you need to kind of balance.
And how where does Sri Lanka fit in this whole push to conserve and protect bird life?
I think Sri Lanka is a really good model with the Field Ornithology Group and the work that they do in Sri Lanka. They do a lot of surveys and they work with a lot of communities. And the best thing in Sri Lanka is our forest that was lost was replaced by agroforestry, like our home gardens. So we don't, as far to my knowledge, we haven't had a single species of bird in Sri Lanka go extinct, because they live in the forest, but they also live in our landscapes. And even I think in Colombo, you just go outside and you see a lot of different species of birds as well. So Sri Lanka is a good model because, like in Southeast Asia, where deforestation is ongoing and oil palm and acacia and all these things are happening, they don't really have a good tropical model of how have landscapes been changed where you can actually keep some of the diversity still there. And Sri Lanka, to me, is pretty much a good model in that sense.
And in Sri Lanka, we've had this move towards going towards what we call a green economy. We've had the government move towards using a greater reliance on organic fertilizer, for example, and so on. But inside this whole move towards green economy, we also had a presidential order to do away with palm cultivation and so on, citing that the waterbed is being affected and so on. Will this affect bird life eventually, or are these two things?
I think I think there's two sides of that story. Like, and I've worked in oil palm in Southeast Asia for almost 15 years now, and I've actually seen the kind of destruction that monoculture does. But I'd like to draw your attention to pretty much the world's largest oil palm producer, which is Nigeria. Now, in Nigeria, you don't really get big oil palm estates, but what you do get is you get oil palm in the agroforestry network. So people's oil is coming from that, so that it's coming from their own supply within. So I don't agree with monocultures. Like even in Sri Lanka, if you talk about mangoes, if you remove all them and you just have only mango trees, you will have a limited amount of diversity. But our agroforestry network has so many species. And I think oil palm as a part of the agroforestry system is not a bad idea. Monocultures, yes. But of course, the other big problem about oil palm is how do you process it? Like a lot of the pollution that comes from oil palm, people don't talk about it. It's not just the deforestation, it's the kind of emissions that you get from an oil palm factory and what you do with that. It can be managed, but it needs to be done in a managed way. Like a good example is that some places in Indonesia, you get oil palm concessions the size of Sri Lanka. So they're huge on that scale.
So how do they manage the so-called environmental destruction then?
I think it's very early for us to say. Like one thing is that a lot of the deforestation, it's not being, some places are managed well, some places are not. But there are things like the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil, which one thing that happens is that before you clear a site for agriculture, you have to check what biodiversity is there and conserve parts of it. And some of those forests that have been conserved are some of the best forests that you can find as well. So it's also a financing mechanism. We need to understand, though, in Southeast Asia that if you're going to do agriculture, it's very difficult to actually have biodiversity as well. You need a mix of the two things. We're still in very early days. We're still in the first few decades of oil palm in Southeast Asia. So there are serious issues, serious environmental issues. And right now, a lot of the focus is more on the biodiversity than the pollution aspect of it. So it's still, but in a case like Sri Lanka in particular, we have really good systems with agriculture and monitoring mechanisms that it's possible for us to develop a system which is different. We don't need to follow the rest of the world in oil palm. We can do it in a different way. We need to adapt it, not use the monoculture kind of techniques that you get in Southeast Asia, but more the Nigerian method of part of a system. Then you can actually be oil self-sufficient, but not change the system too much. I think that Sri Lanka shouldn't do that, shouldn't try to have a huge scale change in our agroforestry, but adding on and slowly incremental steps, I think it's possible.
But as we approach a break, I'd like to ask you, you don't really associate Nigeria with this sort of cultivation, and if ever, it would have been crude oil from the ground, I suppose. And so, is there a bona fide case for concern in Sri Lanka about oil palm cultivation?
I think there's a bona fide case about any monoculture cultivation as a whole. Whether it is oil palm or whether it's coconut or any other thing, I think any monoculture, there are issues. And that's a good thing in Sri Lanka because, but we also can think about, if you think about a landscape, Sri Lanka's ecosystems haven't really changed. Like our wetland systems were converted to paddy fields and our forests were converted to agroforests. So the ecosystem function of Sri Lanka hasn't really changed that much. So if you're thinking about monoculture plantations, where would you put them without disturbing the ecosystem? Because I think Sri Lanka's survival for climate change, we are going to be one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. We need to think about that we need to think about it now because we are going to see it in our lifetimes. By the time 50 years from now, our kids are going to be living that life. So we need to think about our ecosystems, about more or less climate change. Where would we put a monoculture plantation but not affect the ecosystem too much? Because an oil palm tree still is a tree. It does something, but the problem is monocultures where you clear the undergrowth, you clear everything, and you don't have any other things in the system. So I don't think, because if you think about it, where's the land going to come from? Are we going to convert our rubber plantations to oil palm? And then if you change the rubber to oil palm, then you have a whole series of issues with that. And by and large, rubber is I think it's an up and coming thing. It's changing because it's the most environmentally friendly source of rubber that you can get other than fossil fuel based rubber, synthetic rubber.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so uh, okay, that's the problem. How do you move away from this, as you call it, this monoculture? Or what's the best option for Sri Lanka in your
Um,
view?
in my view, I think one of the things is that this big move that we had for agroforestry or even the non-use of fertilizers kind of thing is a good idea, but I think it needs to be looked at at an ecosystem function level. Like for
Mm-hmm.
instance, if you think of a tea plantation is a monoculture. As beautiful as the highlands are, it's a monoculture with only tea, and when it rains, the soil kind of washes away. How do we kind of change those systems into a mix of different agriculture crops, whether it's coffee or spices or trees and everything or reforestation? It needs to be that level. And for instance, our watersheds in particular, I'm pretty sure near every single river there's a buffer zone. Those kind of things can be reforested. There's land that could be used for that's where the public could get seriously involved in looking after their water resources, like reforestation programs, and looking at part of them can be monocultures, part of them can be reforestation, part of them can be agroforestry, but looking at it at a watershed level and how those function. And we can do that. I think that it's possible for us to do that and also become sustainable at the same time. And as we do that, our productivity will increase. Definitely, we'll have more crops coming out. But I also do think that one limit that our systems have is when people think about the tropics, we think about beautiful rainforests and that the soil must be so fertile that these trees are big. But in reality, it's a cycle. There's a limited amount of nutrients, and it's all in the vegetation, in the trees and the plants. And when you remove that vegetation, you remove all those nutrients. So that's why we need to constantly keep on adding in fertilizer to a system, because there's a limited amount. So if we want to reforest this ecosystem, we will need to bring back the nutrients to allow it to support that vegetation that we want. Because it's not about planting a tree. You can plant a tree and it can stay like a small sapling for 20 years, not growing, because it doesn't have the nutrients to grow to a big tree. That kind of capacity to look at these systems as ecosystems, functioning ecosystems, whether it's an agroforestry, even if it's in a monoculture system, it's an ecosystem. And we need to think about these plants as living organisms, and what does this living organism need to grow? And that is important, because if that plant can't grow, we can't survive. So it's kind of taking the mindset like of our farmers, thinking about agriculture in the long term. How they've been managing systems in the long term has always been about long-term sustainability. We have changed it a little bit with the kind of crops that we grow, but the principles are the same. And now we need to adapt that into something where we're producing spices and taking them out. But do note that if you produce a crop and you take it out, like even if it's oil palm or tea, you're taking nutrients out of a system. If you're taking nutrients out of a system, then eventually there'll be no nutrients left in the system. So you need to put it back. So even in the organic farming sense, if we start producing organic compost all around the country and we start using it on our farms and we keep on exporting spices out of the country, there will be generally a negative nutrient balance. Most of the nutrients are going out of the country, and at some point our soils will become not fertile anymore. So we need to replace, like if we're going to export 100 tons of phosphorus through agriculture products, we need to add that 100 tons of phosphorus back into the system.
Right.
There's a limit. There's a limit that the ecosystem can support.
So, is that an easy answer? Is Sri Lanka going are we on the correct trajectory when we are trying to go all organic?
I think it's ideally it's a perfect thing to do. It's the thing that the whole world, like when we think about Europe or any other parts of the world, everyone is trying to go in that direction. But it's a need to do it not in a 1 or 2 year step. We need to have at least a 10 to 15 year plan and a 5-year stepwise thing. Like a good example is there's a botanic garden that I used to be in Edinburgh in Scotland. And in that garden, they have a target to change all the plants to native plants or conservation important plants. But the target is only about 1 to 5% per year. Because it has to be a realistic target that can be achieved. There are certain parts of our system which can be converted to organic farming immediately. But we still need to realize that you need to add that fertilizer back in. Like if you're producing compost in parts of Sri Lanka and applying it somewhere else, you're just transferring nutrients from one part of the country to another. But eventually, when you harvest the crop and you export the crop, you're sending it out. or even if you're not exporting it, like vegetables, you eat the vegetables, most of our vegetable waste gets flushed down the toilet. So it's leaving the system completely. And I mean, and if you think about it, our ancestors used to be using human waste for fertilizers. It's that is the biggest source of fertilizers. Like if you wanted to go completely organic in Sri Lanka, we should actually be looking at that huge resource of fertilizer that's getting flushed down the toilet.
You mean just waste?
Just waste. It's good. And because you think about a system has a level of a diffuse set of nutrients. What a plant does is it concentrates all those nutrients into a fruit. And what you do is you harvest the fruit and you eat the fruit. And what do we do after we eat the fruit? We go to the toilet and we flush it down the toilet. So pretty much you're taking all the nutrients in a system, eating it, concentrating it in yourself, and you're sending it out. So that's the biggest source. And there are places in Europe where they're starting to look at that kind of stuff and how do we extract the nutrients out of that stuff. And we were doing it. Our ancient ancestors were doing it. I mean, the best example is the toilet pit and the bananas in our home gardens, right? Somehow every time you close the toilet pit, you plant some bananas on it, and the bananas on it will taste really good, right? Because all the fertilizers are there. I mean, of course, it's not feces that you're eating. You have to, yeah.
It reminds me of that story about the very expensive coffee. But on that note, let's go for a quick break and take a peek at this evening's headlines from the wonderful Newsfirst primetime news team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
KDK, the leader in indoor air quality. Over 110 years in bringing you the best of Japanese innovation and technology. KDK, the reliable fan.
Valuable Finance, best finance company.
රැස්වීදෙන ජීවිතේ
1,000 days since the April 21st attacks. Where is justice?
නමුත් එදා ඉඳලා අද වෙනකම් මොන පරීක්ෂණයක්ද මේ ගැන සිද්ධ වුණේ? කාගෙන්ද ප්‍රශ්න කළේ? මෙවන් තත්ත්වයක් එවැනි ත්‍රස්ත ක්‍රියා පාලනය කිරීමට පාලනයේ වෙනසක් ඉල්ලා සිටින තත්ත්වයකට මඟ පාදනු ඇත.
Will there be power cuts due to a fuel shortage? Train strike leaves passengers stranded. Biography of Chandrika Bandaranaike published. Central Expressway from Mirigama to Kurunegala declared open.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
And welcome back to Newsline Zoom on a day that we are marking Thai Pongal. And in case you missed it earlier, happy Thai Pongal to everyone. Now then, our guest is has joined us by Zoom. Thank you, Zoom, from all the way in Singapore. And he is, of course, Dr. Lahiru Wijedasa, who has been recently appointed the Asia Forest Coordinator. And we're having a very interesting chat with Dr. Wijedasa here. Tell me, Dr. Lahiru Wijedasa, in Sri Lanka, we had another controversy not many moons ago when there was a proposal to try to put a reservoir, a water reservoir, on the outskirts of the Singharaja forest. This caused a complete uproar. And firstly, I was quite surprised at the intensity of the concern. Are we right, or is this just politics? Should there be a concern when you're trying to go into a world protected site and try and put a water reservoir?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a point for concern, because we don't have that much tropical rainforest left in Sri Lanka. That's one of the ironies in Sri Lanka is that I think only 6% of the lowland rainforest of Sri Lanka, which probably hosts around 60 or 70% of our biodiversity, there's only about 6% of it left. And this accounts for a very small fraction of our protected areas. So while we have huge nature reserves like Yala, Vilpattu and everything, most of them is for big mammals. But most of the Sri Lankan endemics are mostly tiny reptiles, tiny plants, tiny insects that you find nowhere. So I understand the need to balance the need of the people, like when we need water, hydroelectricity and everything. But we have already lost a lot. We have lost a lot of these ecosystems and there's so little left. And add to that climate change. We really don't know what the impacts of climate change are going to be on these systems. Like when the temperature of the world goes up, we might have a forest reserve, but it might be surrounded by plantations and it might dry out. We need to think about even that, like whether Singaraja will survive or not. It needs a lot of work. Needs us to think 100 years. We've gone through the 20 hottest years in human history, and we don't really know what impact that has had on our forest already. We can see like the water reserves drying out. We've seen forests vanishing. We've seen forest fires increase. We've seen many, many things. So I think that we shouldn't disturb systems too much because the intact systems are the ones that are resilient.
The world economy is obviously driven by the world's global corporates. The corporates all over the world play their role in driving the economies of the world. And so what responsibilities should corporates have when it comes to saving our ecosystem, sustaining it for future generations? And particularly in Sri Lanka, how are corporates fitting into this space?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And I think that philosophically, if I said something, I'd say that with great power comes great responsibility. And corporates can actually do a lot more than governments can do, because governments are restricted by their constituents, but corporates can actually do whatever they think is right. And in Southeast Asia, one thing we're seeing right now is a lot of conservation work, which is being funded by corporates. And a good example is certain agriculture concessions in Southeast Asia, where the entire forest huge parts of the forest are within the concession. So by making money in some parts through agriculture, they're actually funding the forest conservation work within their concession. A good example, of course, is the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil, where some things like that are happening. And a good example, adding to that, is about 30% of Indonesia's forests are in concession, agriculture concessions managed by companies. And some of this is the best protected ones. And the species that I just recently described was from an agriculture concession, where you have tigers, elephants, a lot of new species, a lot of birds, everything in there. So in Sri Lanka's context, I think that's where we need corporates. Like we think about concessions like the tea plantations, all in the mountains, and they definitely have plots that are not productive in the highlands or abandoned areas or riverine areas. Those areas can be reforested and a lot of carbon could come in. And that adds to the next part of it, which is about the carbon markets. That right now, because the world needs to sequester a lot of carbon, a lot of the Western countries don't have enough places to get carbon out of. They're actually paying countries for offsetting. So by doing this restoration work and doing it in a wise way, we can actually make that money. Like and to give a good example, I think a ton of carbon goes for about $7 to $10 now, and it's expected to go to about $22. And a standing forest has about 300 tons of carbon. Right. So when you think about and that kind of thing over a time scale of 5 to 10 years has the potential to solve Sri Lanka's economic crisis as well, whilst making us resilient to climate change.
And what role in that case does government have? What can governments do to help corporates play their role?
I'm a big believer in people power, that I think eventually it comes down to the person going and planting. And I think that the role of government should just mainly be to enable people to do that. In Sri Lanka, we have a public who's highly aware of environmental issues. We don't need to convince people on the need to do it, but we need to show them how and give them the building blocks to be able to do it. It's not about planting a tree, but it's about managing the tree after you plant it. You need to probably, after you plant it, you need to look after it for 3 to 5 years. So corporates in particular, a good example is they shouldn't have just plant a tree program. They should be invested long term in how do we do this. And a good example in Indonesia is that we also know the roles of birds and mammals in dispersing seeds. So what you really want to do in restoration is you want to just enable nature to do its own thing.
Yeah.
You want to intervene at the minimum. And I think the role of government in that sense is allowing companies and enabling the public as well to be able to do that, giving them the opportunity to think about these things and how are we going to do this? How are we going to survive climate change? Because whether we survive climate change or not is still a personal choice.
And if you look at Sri Lanka's particular problem right now, which is a crisis of the availability of foreign exchange, how quickly can you change these carbon credits to real dollars to help our long-suffering central bank?
Well, I think it's relatively rapidly possible. Like if you have a project, an area where you right now in my current job, that's kind of what I do, which is actually working with these carbon projects around Southeast Asia, trying to get some of this stuff done. And in some of this work, just the pre-feasibility study and everything is almost about, for about a 10,000 hectare area, it's already about $2 million worth of project costs, which are already sunken in by people who are, so you actually get foreign investors to actually pay for all the development and on all that kind of stuff. And of course, when the carbon credits come, the carbon credits are shared between the people who invested and the government and the public as well. So it's not just a carbon project with someone paying for carbon to go out. You also have a community aspect about it. You have a restoration aspect about it, all that kind of stuff. And it's possible, like if you do it within about a year's time with a real thing, like if the government is really committed, because eventually whether a carbon project works or not depends on government legislation as well. So that's a key role, because if the government doesn't want it to be there, or if we think that within 5 years' time they're going to change their mind, then you're not going to get the carbon money. It has to be at least a commitment for 30 years of that carbon being there. So you need the land secured for at least 30 years. And when we think about the most vacant lands, it doesn't have to be even a government-owned land. It could be a privately owned land. Private people in Sri Lanka can actually do a carbon project and get carbon credits for that. And that brings foreign exchange into the country, while also doing agroforestry, doing other things to make it productive at the same time. It's possible. We can regenerate our ecosystem. Yeah, it's possible.
And because of Sri Lanka's sort of very specialist areas of tourism, for example, and so on, how does Sri Lanka fare in terms of people who come to observe birds and so on? How are we off regionally, at least? Are we doing good? Are we mediocre? How are we doing there? What's the perception of Sri Lanka?
In general, I'm a bit biased in my perception, though, because I'm a kind of a scientist and an ecologist. So I see things in places. I see a lot of things being called ecotourism, but we don't really know what ecotourism. We haven't defined what ecotourism really is. If ecotourism is just about going around and looking at biodiversity, that's just tourism. But we just had an eco part, because what you're looking at is you're looking at a bird instead of an ancient ruin. So we do have that benefit that we have these landscapes that are all really mixed. But my biggest issue is that whether that ecotourism is going to survive into the long term. Like if these people are coming to see biodiversity, that biodiversity needs to survive climate change. It needs to survive the next 30 years first. And with all the changes that were happening, we're not so sure about that. So an ecotourism thing, in my view, should also have a component where it's actually giving back to managing the system. Like bringing tourists and taking them around a jeep in a national park is just, you can do that in Colombo or in a zoo even, you can do that. It's just like a glorified zoo, but what kind of contribution is that bringing to actually managing the area or even restoring
and what kind of contribution should it be? Say some hotel says, look, come and stay with us because we are eco-friendly. What should that hotel be doing to sustain their claim and support their claim that they are an eco-resort?
Well, first thing first, I think that these, like for instance, if you think about, let's use a good example of something like Waskamua and that area where you have a whole series of hotels. Those hotels could pretty much be funding the protected area management in those areas. And not only protected areas when it comes to the elephant wildlife conflict and all those kind of issues, those tourists those tourist entities are making money off those elephants who are also causing problems for villages. So there needs to be a sharing system of the community and the companies, and everything needs to see these elephants as our elephants. These elephants are bringing prosperity to all of us, and we need to manage them in a way, because there's definitely going to be human-elephant conflicts when you have elephants in a protected area, and they're not going to stay in the protected area. They're going to go outside. So you need to kind of have that kind of where we are all benefiting from it, but you are all suffering the consequences of our benefit. That kind of balance needs to be there, and into the long term, then it'll work. And a good example in Cambodia is something called ibis rice, where the ibis, that particular species of ibis in Cambodia, is a very threatened one, and it lives in the rice fields. By converting all those to organic farms and everything, and actually marketing the rice as ibis rice, we were able to get this kind of conservation outcomes, but keeping the rice going as well. And people pay more for the rice because the birds are conserved. And in the case of elephants as well, I honestly think that the rice coming from these places that are under human-elephant conflicts near protected areas should be marketed as elephant rice. Because you're going to have at least around 20 to 30% of your crop vanishing because of elephant damage. But having the elephants there brings the tourism income. And if you market it as elephant rice, and you're selling that elephant rice probably in the tourist outlets and paying the farmers for it, they're getting a direct benefit from the elephants there. And they're okay with the elephants. So this thing about turning a environmental problem into an environmental benefit is something that we need to look at more, because there's very few places in the planet with elephants, and to have elephants with people and manage it in a way, I think that's a win-win, converting a bad situation into a positive one.
It's been terribly interesting talking to you, Dr. Lahiru Wijedasa, who is, of course, the newly appointed Asia Forest Coordinator by BirdLife International. Thank you very much for your time, and good luck in your new appointment. And I hope that you do your bit to help the world into a better space, eco speaking, of course. Thank you, and that's the way it was on Newsline Zoom this evening. Take care, have a great evening ahead of you, and as always, God bless you.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.